Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to talk. It's a new setting for me. It was the first time I learned about the ASEAN Parliament for Human Rights, and so it's a pleasure and an honor to be with you. First slide, I think. Yes, the general picture first is that it is a quite unprecedented type of crisis that we have to face. The simultaneous, immediate, and massive character, global diffusion, quite rapid. The fact that it affects at the same time the supply and the demand side, which of course has very serious implications as to the way of responding in general economic terms to that crisis. Another aspect is and I think it's important to keep it in mind as the background, is that the economic recession is actually self-inflicted. It's not a situation in which we would have it will result from natural cause, natural disaster, destructions, or be the transmission of, as was previously the case, for instance, transmission to in real terms of financial crisis. Here, the recession, the direct cause of the recession is the decisions that were deliberately taken by the public authorities in order to contain the pandemic, and decisions to restrict or even stop movements of peoples and business activities. So that's the direct cause of the current recession is there. And that means that at the end of the day, when we'll have to think about the origins of the crisis, we will have to look into that and why what was originally a health crisis turned out so rapidly to turn into a massive recession. And the last aspect is that it has very contrasted effects on employment and work. I remember last week when I spoke with Canel, and it was not totally clear to me what was the topic of our meeting today, because some of the messages refer to the right to work and others to working rights, and so as to say, but we will talk about both. And actually, yes, the impact of the crisis affects both the right to work, in that many workers have lost their jobs, lost their incomes, lost when it was related, it was linked to their employment, lost their social protection. While on the opposite end, we have a situation in which workers are actually expected to overwork with increased risk, including for their own health, and that's the case of all of course, health workers, but other frontline responders, and also work or services that cannot be interrupted. So that's a very also asymmetric, I would say, situation in which large part of the workers see their very employment under threat, while others are somehow compelled to work in conditions that can be risky for them. Next slide. So, when looking at the approach of the ILO to the responses to the crisis, I think reference can be made to an instrument that is relatively recent, which was adopted in 2017, and it is called as the not very elegant name of Employment and Decent Work for Peace and Resilience recommendation. That recommendation was adopted in a process that was partly artificial, but partly motivated also, in the form of the revision of a recommendation adopted in 1944 on transition from war to peace. So that was the transition of the getting out of the Second World War, and it's interesting to see that it was adopted by the same conference in Philadelphia that adopted the Declaration of Philadelphia, which is part of the constitution of the ILO, and which is a very important document about the values and the objectives of the organization. Now, that recommendation is useful because it provides guidance on measures to prevent, to respond to, and to recover from situations of crisis arising from conflicts and disasters. So primarily, as a revision of the recommendation 144, primarily seen as a post-conflict recommendation, but actually it extends also to other forms of disruptions, including disasters, including health disasters such as pandemics. What is important here is that the recommendation keeps a distinction all through the text between what is the response, what is the prevention, and what is the recovery. So there are specific recommendations that are made in these three phases, and they should not be confused with one another. And we'll see that it can be important to keep that distinctions between the three aspects separate. The emphasis of the recommendation is that there should be a strategic response to, at the same time, promote employment, respect fundamental rights at work, ensure the basic social protection, and it also insists on having the measures that are developed in response to the crisis developed and adopted through social dialogue. Next. So first, respect in the response to the crisis for the fundamental principles and rights at work. I understand that you had already a discussion about the issues of the issue of respect for fundamental rights in general, fundamental civil, political rights, in the context of the response to the crisis. And we are, I mean, in all countries in the world, and not only in the region, we are facing exceptional measures that are restricting fundamental rights and freedoms. Freedoms of movement, for instance, but also freedoms of meeting, reunion. That all, of course, these restrictions have a bearing on the exercise of fundamental rights at work, including, first of all, freedom of association. So the question here, for all these restrictions, is that are these restrictions truly necessary to address the crisis, proportionate, and maybe more importantly, are they really temporary? Are they not actually creeping restriction that will subside, even that will persist even after the end of the crisis phase? So it's a general issue for freedom of association, but also it's where there are undue restrictions to freedom of expression and communication. They can be also contrary to Convention 105, and all the Convention 105 is the abolition of forced labor convention, which prohibits the use of forced labor as a mean of political repression, basically, for expressing political opinion, dissenting political opinions, I would say. And it's a convention that in all countries in the region that have ratified, all these countries already have problems in the application of the convention. Another issue is and we start to witness that in several countries in the region, is the risk of anti-union redundancies. I mean, there are dismissals, collective dismissals are justified by the economic situation of the enterprises, but it happens. Surprise that the preference when the preference of people fired shows that actually they are trade union members and activists. So that's a basic issue also for freedom association. Yeah. Next slide, please. Forced labor. Forced labor. Here we have a clear exception that is made in Convention 29. So the Convention 29 is about the suppression of forced labor in all its form, but with possible exceptions. One of the exceptions is the possibility of imposing labor in case of emergency, and this, of course, includes epidemics. Now, what is important is that the extent, the duration, and the purpose of the imposed work of service must remain strictly limited to what is necessary to address the immediate situation. And one important aspect here is that it's not because certain categories of workers in essential services, including health services, can be required under compulsion to work, that their health and safety should not be protected. Because one of the way of ensuring for workers to ensuring that their health and safety is protected is actually to exercise their right of withdrawal from a danger for their health or safety. And of course, in case of obligation to work, they cannot make use of that right, and therefore it is all the more important to ensure that their health and safety is properly protected. Next slide, please. I would be very rapid on the question of discrimination. There is, of course, the risk of gender-based discrimination, and the gender dimension must be taken into account in all aspects of the response to the crisis. But there's also the need to prevent and mitigate crisis effects on vulnerable groups of workers, such as migrant workers and domestic workers. And often they are actually the same. I mean, domestic workers are often women, and they are almost always migrant workers. Next slide. The main message, I would say, if there is one message that you can take from the recommendation and the actual approach of the ILO right now, is that the crisis response must be based on social dialogue. There are two immediate objectives for crisis response, which are preserving employment and incomes of the workers and supporting sustainable enterprises. And one through the other. I mean, it's not possible to preserve employment if we don't preserve the sustainability of enterprises. And that, of course, calls for actually reconciling the interest and of both sides. So this, by their very nature, these objectives call for decision through bipartite or tripartite social dialogue. They are not, and this is also a message of the recommendation, they are not a matter for, well, crisis response is not the right time to engage in labor law reform. It's time for temporary measures to adjust the existing law to the circumstances. And this is best be done by those first interested in the workers and the employers. So many relevant matters can be subject to that social dialogue. For instance, how to prevent dismissals, how to reduce their scope, how to, as far as possible, prefer temporary suspension of work rather than dismissal, how to decide on the level of compensation for partial unemployment, etc., the use of annual leave, the possibility of unpaid or paid leave. All this has to be a subject for social dialogue and not be unilaterally imposed without at least consultation. I think that's I have to conclude. I mean, it's always, I always realize that 10 minutes is a very short time. I give you the references here, so you can have the text, simply the text of the recommendation, and also a paper on international labor standards that was prepared by the standards department in Geneva, and that I find a bit difficult to use, because it only reminds us of what are the requirements of standards, but it has very little to say about the practical use that can be made in the crisis response of these standards. And that's also why I put the date, because the situation is evolving rapidly, and maybe it would not be presented in the same way as it were issued now. Thank you very much.